say is related to the context of the situation. So Mr. Brody testified to this morning. When we search our own consciences, when we know that we are fundamentally honest people, we all know that we have told white lies. Nicole Mitchell, a month ago, told a white lie to her children because something terrifying happened, and she did not want to terrify her children. Does that call her character into question? The thing that she said to those kids was not true. But she said it because if she had told them the truth, it would have caused a trauma that few children would ever experience. At the beginning of this case, before opening statements, when we were asking you questions to determine who would sit in this jury, one of you being questioned was asked about Alzheimer's patients. And she told us, and she told you, in her experience, that sometimes you say things that aren't true so that you don't aggravate the situation. We all know the difference between a white lie and a meaningful, damaging one. The problem is that this happened in the context of something that was a terrible mess. A mess that Nicole made, but it was a mess. And the state wants you to fixate on that because the actual evidence in this case is contrary to what they want you to believe that those white lies were about. And let's really think about what the state absolutely needs you to believe. The state needs you to believe that Nicole Mitchell, a person who has spent 30 years in the military, a legislator, a mom, a lawyer, and a daughter herself to two separate moms, each with Alzheimer's, would drive 3 hours to take a shirt that had already been promised to her, that she would throw away her entire life for some things she knew she was going to get anyway. If somebody believes she was there to steal, she never would have left the basement. That's where Rod's things were. If somebody believes she was there to steal, she never would have gone upstairs. Going upstairs means welfare check. The state can't have it both ways. The moment you understand the real reason she was there, the welfare check, Nicole's white lies make perfect sense. And the state has focused on things that are not relevant to the accusations in the instructions. That Nicole Mitchell exercised poor judgment about how she did the welfare check. She told you as much. That's not a crime. The state wants you to feel bothered by that and create the illusion that somehow that's a reason to convict her of these crimes. She's not charged with lying. Once Rod Mitchell died, no one else on the planet knew Carol Mitchell truly better than Nicole Mitchell did. And she knew that Carol was deleting texts and isolating herself from people who cared for her. I resent, and I think you should too, that some of the testimony about how Carol and Nicole Mitchell had an acrimonious relationship somehow means they don't love each other. Has anyone had an acrimonious relationship with someone they love? Is that really beyond reason and common sense? I suspect if you on the jury are like most of the rest of us here, most of your most acrimonious relationships are with people you care about and people you love. It's because the love binds us, and sometimes we don't get along. So what? One thing that is often true about a prosecutor's case, when they don't have the right facts, they will misstate the law and ignore the facts that create reasonable doubt. The state told you to use your common sense. The expression common sense is in the instructions the court gave you. But the standard is reason and common sense. If we use pure reason, we look like logic robots and we can make silly mistakes. If we use pure common sense, we activate our biases. The other set of instructions that you were told you about. You must use both if you are faithful to the instructions the court gave you. Do not let the state deceive you from that. Sergeant Glander testified that you cannot ascertain a person's intent from damage to the window. He agreed that a point of entry of the window could be consistent with other things, trespassing or damage to the property. You can't ascertain a person's intent from that. Now, there was testimony from 2, possibly 3 state's witnesses, law enforcement officers, about the mistakes that they made in the investigation. And the implication was that everybody in this case is to get grace except for Nicole Mitchell. It's okay that law enforcement makes mistakes. We are fallible human beings. It's not okay if those mistakes cut against the citizen accused. And let's be really, really clear about this. There is only one side being tested here. There is only one case here. It is the state's case. And there is something that criminal defense attorneys who protect people's rights are always afraid of. That when they call witnesses, which we don't always do, that it creates the illusion in the minds of the jury that there's a case here and a case there, and that we have to prove something. We have to prove nothing. Every piece of evidence that we brought up, whether it was through cross-examination, which is evidence, whether it was calling witnesses, whether it was introducing an exhibit, is solely to do one thing: to point out the reasonable doubts in the state's case. There is only one case here. That is what you are here to evaluate. The state decides what charges to bring. They decide what tests they're going to take. It is such an important test that the standard is extremely high. And the way they have to pass the test is by meeting the standards imposed by multiple parties. The court obviously has a special role, and you will get a copy of the instructions. These show the exact standards that the state has to meet to pass this test. The defense is tasked with pointing out every single mistake that the state made. And the jury is tasked with judging every single piece of evidence, deciding what weight to assign to every single piece of that evidence, including no weight at all if the jury decides that. Looking at every single reasonable doubt that the defense points out and finding reasonable doubts on their own. The fact that I may not talk about a reasonable doubt here doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You get to investigate and find your own. And that is part of your professional charge here. That is professional. It's part of your obligation here to find those reasonable doubts. What has the state spent the most time trying to prove? That Nicole Mitchell came up in the middle of the night. That she wore dark clothing and a black cap. That she parked on a side street. And that she came in through a window. That's the how. Which we know and basically everybody agrees on. But the state has, in my estimation, pretty shamefully tried to convince you that the why doesn't matter. That the intent can be ignored. But the intent is everything. Now, before I get into an argument, my argument for you, we're going to talk about some of the reasonable doubts that are clear. Carol Mitchell is clearly and obviously struggling with Alzheimer's. It would be an act of unkindness and unhelpful to go through it in any aggressive way. It was clear from the beginning. It was clear based on what Jonathan Keel said that Rod's death really set it off. But I want to talk about a few of them to make sure that we remember that this really is a problem, that this really was something that Carol's struggling with. And some of them are little. Carol says it's a lavender pry bar. It's very big, but of course in reality it was much smaller and blue. I had never seen that before in a trial in my career. This woman who's doing the best she could literally says that's not the crowbar. Carol testified to you that Rod Mitchell died in 1993. That is the kind of mistake, literally a generation apart in terms of when he passed, that attests to the deterioration. Nicole Mitchell was not added as a contact in Carol Mitchell's phone until March 10th, 2024. This is exactly what Nicole Mitchell feared. That Carol Mitchell deleted texts and deleted contacts on her phone. We know this for a fact. There's text messages introduced that show they had communication. Special Agent Vic Mark testified that when he looked at Carol's phone, there were no text messages between Carol and Nicole. It's just patently mistaken. We know that they were there. And this raises a mistake, a scary mistake, a mistake that endangers Nicole Mitchell's future, that they did not extract that phone. Special Agent Vic Mark testified that he had Carol Mitchell's phone, that he didn't do an extraction. He never even testified whether he asked her if he could do that. So we don't know all the exchanges. We don't know whether she'd been scammed. What we do know is what Nicole Mitchell experienced through her exchanges with Carol Mitchell, through her exchanges with people that are close to her. And the evidence has shown that nobody is actually deeply taking care of Carol Mitchell. It is poignant to me that if you were to talk to Carol Mitchell and you didn't know her and talk to her for a minute or two, she would seem like a completely put together human being. That it takes time to see the breakdown. It takes time to see the forgetfulness. Pam Muxfeld wasn't really taking care of her. Pam Muxfeld didn't see it as a big deal when Nicole contacted her. Pam Muxfeld testified to you that in her estimation it wasn't quite what other people thought. Jonathan Keel hadn't taken her to medical appointments. He lives in the cities. Mr. Jim Headland, the friend of the late Rod Mitchell, he had made a commitment, a promise to help her, but it was clear from his memory, from his abilities, he wasn't in the position to genuinely help her. Dee Lindholm, Pam Muxfeld testified that her mom, Dee Lindholm, was too old to be power of attorney, much less manage someone else who was struggling with Alzheimer's. And certainly not her neighbors or friends. I have a duty for someone who's a neighbor or a friend to take up for someone. Another reasonable doubt is that Nicole clearly believed in her heart that Carol was struggling. We have seen this evidence. We have seen that no one was stepping up for her. It is a misrepresentation by the state. He misrepresented it in his cross-examination of Ms. Mitchell yesterday. And I submit that he misrepresented it in his closing today. That Nicole didn't express concern about Carol Mitchell's paranoia or Alzheimer's when she was in custody for that period of time. Nicole Mitchell does tell Officer Sternhagen about Carol's paranoia. Nicole Mitchell does bring up Alzheimer's repeatedly. It does come up. We expect state witnesses to tell the truth and to tell the whole truth. And it is problematic when every single law enforcement officer who testified on direct did not admit that Nicole Mitchell had none of Rod or Carol's belongings until after I asked them that question. That is a fact that should have been readily presented to you straight away. It should not have been hidden from you. Nicole Mitchell didn't have any of these possessions. And I ask you, when you go back and you're deliberating and talking, these other things about a laptop, which we know had nothing to do with this. The bobber, which wasn't there, had already been sent to Nicole. These other things, they're not part of it. But Nicole Mitchell didn't have any of these things. Every law enforcement officer said, well, one, they were all reluctant to testify about it. I didn't see this, I didn't see that. There were no piles of items or mementos staged by these windows. There was no bag of anything. And there were certainly none of these things in Nicole Mitchell's backpack. Just keep coming back to the basement. That's where Rod's stuff is. Why on earth, if somebody intends to steal something, would they not just do it and leave? The state needs you to ignore that. Nicole Mitchell says, I'm clearly not very good at this. Clearly. She's not. She failed to help to get Carol the help that she needs. If Nicole Mitchell had been good at this, she would have been able to take pictures. She would have been able to document things. make good notes. She would be able to make sure that Carol Mitchell's location was known to the other people who actually lived in the area. So at least that they would have been on notice. We know Nicole Mitchell wasn't good at this because Carol doesn't understand what's going on, and no one is fully helping her to this day. When Carol Mitchell testified, she was being asked very simple questions, very easy questions. You may recall she was searching through the courtroom for answers, and the judge did have to remind her she wasn't able to do that. She's not getting the help she needs. The note that the state lost, what fortunately was preserved in a flash on a body camera. The note shows what Nicole Mitchell intended to do, and it shows that she was right. Checking for deleted texts. She was right. And nothing on that note says anything about the state's claims of intent. Can you imagine if that note had said, go find a shirt, go find mementos? Good Lord, that would be the whole case. The note shows Nicole Mitchell's intent to go check on Carol Mitchell. And in the context of all this relationship, this strained relationship, her love for her stepmom, a love for her stepmom that was different than the love for her own biological mom. She was also loyal to Carol Mitchell because Carol loved Rod, Rod loved Nicole, Nicole loved Rod. It was entangled. She was loyal to her dad and by extension loyal to Carol, above and beyond her loyalty to Carol Mitchell. Jonathan Keel really seemed to struggle to testify about a lot of things. He actually didn't remember a conversation he had had just a few weeks before with an investigator. I mean, a few weeks before this trial. But he did tell Sergeant Glander, and Sergeant Glander put in his report, there was never a disagreement, and that Carol had been holding items of Rod's for Nicole and her boys, knowing that they would want those items. So let's think about the only item that really seems to be at issue here. The flannel shirt. The flannel shirt was hanging all by itself. The flannel shirt was hanging by itself with a bunch of other clothes. The flannel shirt had not been taken off. It hadn't been crumpled up. It hadn't been put in a bag. It hadn't been put by a window. It was hanging there. Nicole Mitchell had wanted that shirt. That would have been a pretty easy thing. She turned the lights on. She went into the house, used the bathroom, and turned the lights on. It would have been so easy to take this shirt, and it wasn't touched. When we think about intent, let's think about the facts. There's an expression in the military that we don't rise to the circumstances. We fall to the level of our training. That's why the more specialized someone in the military is, the more training they need, because when things get crazy, you've got to be able to think clearly. Nicole Mitchell intended to check on Carol Mitchell, and of course everything exploded. And it was her fault that it exploded, but it exploded. And law enforcement was right to deploy their firearms. But that doesn't change the fact that that's a traumatic experience. When Correction Officer Eric Scott testified, he said that Nicole Mitchell at the jail So this is like 40 minutes later. Did not seem to be intentionally uncooperative, but more seemed to be able to not be able to focus on the directives given her. This is a surreal experience for Nicole Mitchell. You can blame her for causing the circumstances. It is surreal. The state's really fixated on this finger flashlight. I've always thought of it as a silly thing. It's not a flashlight I would want to buy, but I've talked to people and they think it's a perfectly good idea. She said she had it for camping, and importantly, it is absolutely in evidence it was purchased before Rod Mitchell died, like February of 2023. So we're literally talking about a year and 2 months before this incident. So it looks fancy, it looks weird, it looks specialized. It's just a thing she had. She brought 2 flashlights. She brought this flashlight. She brought this flashlight that has a sock on it that's held there by a rubber band. This is not my exhibit. I've never been able to touch this flashlight. But Mr. McDonald invited you to look for her son's name under the sock. It's his exhibit. Do it. Do it. As we talked about, it is okay that law enforcement make mistakes sometimes. But it's not okay to hold those mistakes against the citizen accused, against Nicole Mitchell. The state didn't secure the backpack. They didn't secure the keys. They didn't secure the note. The state wants to hold it against the citizen accused who can't execute search warrants, who can't seize things, who can't find records using government power, that she doesn't have these things. It is the state's responsibility to preserve evidence. We talked about this a little bit, but let's really go through it. In the 37 minutes between when Nicole Mitchell has law enforcement contact and when she gets placed in her cell, she knows that law enforcement is going to keep talking to Carol and telling Carol Mitchell what Nicole Mitchell says. Why does she know that? For the same reason you know that. Because we have body camera videos where Carol Mitchell is literally milling around this situation. Carol Mitchell and Nicole Mitchell are having a dialogue. It's going back and forth. Nicole Mitchell knows very well that whatever she says to law enforcement is going to get back to Carol Mitchell. You can see the officers going back and forth inside and outside the house. Nicole Mitchell tells them the truth in that moment, and Carol Mitchell will find out. She has to maintain that white lie to protect Carol Mitchell. As somebody who is a criminal law practitioner, I know very well that alleged victims don't drop charges. It doesn't work that way. Does not work that way. That is a sentiment, a feeling that a lot of people have. Maybe it's from TV, maybe it's because it used to be more common in years past. Nicole Mitchell believes that Carol Mitchell can drop the charges. And she still believes that telling this white lie about these things is the right thing to do until she is in the jail. And the officer, when she asks, can she drop charges? The officer says, that's not a thing. If you watch that video again, that is the moment, that is the instant Nicole Mitchell stops talking about it. That's the instant she realizes that this family spat, that this confused mess that she created is not going to go away when Carol Mitchell realizes what's going on. When she realizes that this white lie is not going to do what needed to be done, it's not going to protect Carol Mitchell, it's not going to protect her, it's not going to serve the interests of anyone, she's done talking. And she had a personal experience about it. She knew from personal experience that people can drop charges. It's problematic in a case like this when the state uses its power to get pieces of evidence that tell part of the story but not the whole story. That tell part of the story that they want but not the story that the jury deserves. That there was a search warrant for what they call the audit log of Carol Mitchell's Sanford My Chart, but not a search warrant for Carol Mitchell's medical records. Nicole Mitchell testified to what she saw on that Sanford My Chart account. And that is absolutely unrebutted testimony. The state failed to get those records. They failed to let anyone in this case see them. And the evidence that we have is the evidence that came in through Nicole Mitchell. I'm embarrassed to admit this, but someone pointed out a reasonable doubt to me that I hadn't thought of, which is that Nicole Mitchell had been to this residence like at least 5 times following the death of Rod Mitchell and before the incident. 5 times. She was down in the basement to reprogram the television. First to set up the Roku, and then to reset it and put the DVD player, install the DVD player with the television. 5 times where opportunities to retrieve these things would have been so easy. Carol's not remembering much. The state wants to impute this bad intention, but also impute this sophistication. If that was a person's intention, why on earth wouldn't you just do it when you had permission to be there in the middle of the day when Carol Mitchell wouldn't have noticed when you're downstairs? This is evidence against this intent claim. This is a doubt based on reason. And we will talk about what a real reasonable doubt is. But any one reasonable doubt as to the element of intent is enough. We need to keep exploring for each and every one. As I said, you are entitled to assign any weight to the state's evidence, including no weight at all. You can evaluate it within its context. The reason we have reasonable doubt is actually not what most people think. Reasonable doubt exists to protect a jury. You are here to evaluate whether the state has met this extremely high burden. And by being subject to this extremely high burden, they have to prove to you that every single doubt based upon reason is ruled out, that there can be no doubts based on reason. And why? Because a jury who is sworn to sit in judgment of another human being has to live with their verdict for the rest of their lives. That is the main reason for proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We are glad, we as a society are glad that proof beyond a reasonable doubt protects citizens accused, that only those where the burden has been met can be marked with that guilty conviction. But its core purpose is to protect the jury, because the weight on a jury of a wrongful conviction lasts forever. 18 years ago, the 35W bridge collapsed down in Minneapolis. It was a pretty new bridge. It was designed with modern techniques and modern materials, but it had a structural weakness. It was a structural weakness that would have been easily noticed if the right people had thought about it. It was always a deficient bridge, but no one fully noticed it until it was too late, and 13 people died. A prosecutor's case is like a bridge. If there is any reasonable chance that the structure could fail, then it has to be scrapped. It doesn't matter if it's mostly good. It doesn't matter if it looks good. It doesn't matter how much it costs. It doesn't matter whose reputation is on the line. It doesn't matter who desperately wants you to believe that the bridge is sound. If there is any reasonable question about its integrity, then it should be scrapped, because the stakes are just too high. However, when a faulty criminal case is built by the state, and they have convinced a jury that their faulty case is really good, that mistake usually sits silently. It sits silently with the accused, who knows the truth, but is left to sit alone for years with its weight. The mistake also sits silently with the jurors. Because as much as the state wants to make this about Nicole Mitchell, it is not. It is solely about whether the state built a bridge so absolutely sound that they eliminated every single reasonable question about its integrity. So much that we would send our children and family across this bridge. Now, you're not bridge builders. You are inspectors. How does it feel to be an inspector who confidently thought the bridge was sound, only to see people fall to their death? Jurors in the past sometimes didn't listen to reasonable doubts and convicted, only to learn years and sometimes decades later that a human being's life was taken away by a wrongful conviction. Now, how do we know this? We know it for a fact because of what are called DNA exonerations. Those defendants looked guilty. They looked guilty to juries just like you. Some of those defendants testified and were made to look inconsistent by prosecutors. Some of them even falsely confessed or had the meanings of their words twisted by the state to look like a confession. But the jury used their common sense instead of the reasonable doubt standard, and they convicted. You see, that's why it doesn't matter how much evidence the state piles up. A doubt based on reason and common sense is the way to avoid this. And that's why the reasonable doubt standard is so crucial. Those defendants who were exonerated looked guilty to those juries. Because those juries sat in a courtroom where endless state witnesses piled things on, and made the accused look as bad as possible. The problem is, and this is where we talk about some of the instructions, if all you have to use is common sense tells you where there's smoke, there's fire. But when you combine reason and common sense, then you have to rule out the possibility of dust or fog, or if the smoke came from somewhere else. When you combine reason and common sense, the government has to rule out the reasonable possibility that Nicole was checking on her stepmom, that she's may have even seen things of her dad's and ignored them, that she was focused on making sure Carol's phone was functional so that she wouldn't get lost and experience a tragedy. You can tell when the state wants you to ignore reasonable doubt because they will sneer at the defense and imply it's ridiculous. But if they could rule out all the reasonable doubts, they would calmly do so. This decision is a decision that you cannot take back. There are two ways for a state to prove a case such that a jury is to find them guilty. They can prove beyond all possibility of doubt, and that is instructed to be guilty. Or they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And the court also instructs a jury to find them guilty if it is beyond all reasonable doubts. But anything less than that is not guilty. This is not like college. This is the toughest test in the legal system. Yes, it is hard to prove this. Why? Because of the effect on the jury and effect on the citizen. We do it this way because this is how we put a check on the state, a check on the government. Whether any of you think this is unfair, this is the way it has been for a very long time. And the danger comes when people don't take it seriously. Because as we talked about before, when there are reasonable doubts, there can be wrongful convictions. This is what it looks like. The state should always want to take up that burden. Let's talk a little bit about burglary and burglary tools. The state asks you to consider why Nicole Mitchell had the pry bar. And she told you, because the screen door was sticky. She already admitted she was going to go in without permission. And she said that it actually bent when she kind of had to pivot and do this other thing in the basement window. The defense is always afraid when there are two charges like this, because a jury might want to split the difference and give something to the state, something to the defense. But as the burglary accusation goes, so goes the burglary tools accusation. Where there's no intent to steal, where there's reasonable doubt as intent to steal, there's no burglary. And where there's no burglary, there's no burglary tools. As you look at this case and realize that there is reasonable doubt as to intent as to burglary, this pry bar is just a pry bar. Again, they could have, charged Ms. Mitchell with anything that they wanted, with anything else related to this pry bar. But when she is not guilty of burglary, she is not guilty of burglary tools. As I wrap up, I am reminded of something that Nicole said yesterday about an exchange that she had with her family, and I think it was in December of 2022. I didn't remember this. Some of you may have. That an elderly woman with some dementia got lost here in Detroit Lakes. And a state trooper figured out, he heard it on dispatch, and he immediately came back. He wasn't detailed to it. He just decided to check, and he kind of used his investigatory ability, and he found this lady in like November or December sitting on the riprap on the side of the lake, getting close to freezing to death. When we hear these stories, when we experience these tragedies, they resonate with us. They stick inside us. They shape how we behave. As a peacetime veteran, I can't help but having reverence for combat veterans like Officer Sternhagen. It's just wired into me. Nicole Mitchell feared the loss of people in her life. Those stories stuck with her. They shape us. The good things shape us, the bad things shape us. And with that cascade of tragedy and terrible news stories about near misses here in our community, it makes sense that she was so activated by all this. One of the hardest things for some juries to accept is that the questions the judge needs them to answer aren't really the questions they want to answer. Maybe you want to answer questions that aren't in front of you. Sometimes juries kind of wish they were more like a TV judge, like Judge Judy. You hear everything, you look at all the evidence, and you decide you did this right and you did this wrong, you did that right and you did that wrong, and I'm going to give you this and give you that, and this is what I'm going to order. To kind of put it all in a ball and fix it. You haven't been given that choice. You haven't been given that choice. You haven't been given the opportunity to decide what should happen because Carol Mitchell was justifiably terrified. You haven't been given an opportunity to decide how much Nicole Mitchell should pay for that window. You haven't been given an opportunity to decide what should happen to Rod Mitchell's shirt. You haven't been given an opportunity to decide how Carol Mitchell should be cared for. But you should feel comfortable knowing that your job in evaluating the state's work here, it still allows other disputes, other courtrooms, and other places. This job, the job that you have been given, is beyond important. A criminal jury is one of the only political bodies, and that's what you are. You are an assembled political body here to evaluate the state's work and decide whether it met the very high standard that we have had for hundreds of years. And once you are done, you as a political body will dissolve, and you will have executed your duty. Yes, it is a heavy weight. It is extremely important. when you are deliberating, if one of your fellow jurors says, well, she said she was there for some of her dad's things, so she must be guilty, remind them that the state is required to rule out any other possible purposes of those statements. It is not our job to prove the opposite. This is the state's case. It is our job to show you the doubts, and it's your job to apply them to the state's case. The state doesn't want you to look at their bad facts. That's why none of the state's witnesses admitted on direct that none of Carol or Nicole Mitchell's stuff was found. Carol or Rod Mitchell their stuff was found with Nicole. You know, not guilty verdicts actually serve the state very well too. It is a crucial reminder to the state to do better, to choose carefully what criminal accusations to make, to think clearly about what justice is and how it is rendered. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be more cases. We, as citizens, want the right cases brought. We want them to be prosecuted in the right way. Not guilty verdicts tell the state to try again and do better. And that is important. This is my last opportunity to speak with you. In a minute, I'm going to hand Nicole Mitchell over to you. And I won't be able to do anything else. The state gets an opportunity to come up here and tell you a completely different story. And if that happens, I want you to be thinking about your responsibility. Why isn't he ruling out every single reasonable doubt? Now, both the possible verdicts on the verdicts forms are framed in terms of guilt. That's what the chart was about. Guilt is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Guilt is not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. There is no third verdict that you will see. There is no third verdict form for innocence. It's not a question here. If somebody brings that up, please remind them. Did the state prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt or not? You don't have the third choice, not in our system. The state needs you to believe that Nicole Mitchell would throw away everything, that she would throw away her career, that she would throw away her family, that she would throw away her ability to be a foster mom for a shirt she knew she was going to get. As we discussed at the beginning of this case, unless the state's evidence can rule out that Nicole Mitchell entered just to check on Carol, then the verdict must be not guilty.